I'd like to welcome everyone to American Cannabis. I'm your host, Ellis Smith. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Cannabis Tech, for hosting our webcast today. Our topic today is how to boost hemp production using multispectral imagery. We've got two guests on today, Dan Staley, who's a principal at Arbor Drone, and we've got Drew Bastian from Business Development Manager at Micah. And so, gentlemen, I want to welcome you on today. Appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Ellis. I appreciate that. So a little bit of background about myself. I've been with Micah for a little over 3 years now. My primary responsibilities at Micah are building out our reseller network around the world, just ensuring that we've got a lot of presence in every international market, and getting our multispectral sensors out to users that way. Before Micah, I worked in the ag industry at a few different organizations. So ag is primarily my background. That's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm looking forward to the webinar today.
Thanks for coming on. Dan, if you would give us a little background on yourself as well.
Ellis, thank you. Appreciate it, and I appreciate the forum today. I come at this from the plant and the mapping side, and in grad school, I was lucky enough to be a student of a land cover change modeler, and so that was my introduction into this space. And last year we were out flying orchards and vineyards and came across some hemp fields and asked the owners if we could fly them, and it looks like we figured out how to understand how hemp grows, and that's how I got in this space.
Wow. Well, this is a topic that I'm very excited to listen to today and learn more about it. We're doing quite a bit of hemp this year at American Cannabis Company, supporting the industry, and so really looking forward to learning more about what you guys are doing and how we can help farmers. And so I'm going to pass it over to you guys to start the presentation, and then once you guys are done with the presentation and slideshow, we'll go into the Q&A from our audience. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and if you have any questions, let me know.
All right, thank you, Ellis. What I'd like to do first is just do a quick little introduction into agriculture and precision agriculture and turn that into how drones are in this space right now. So the reason why we're seeing more drones in precision agriculture is because just the technological breakthroughs in the computing power has reached a point where drones are cheap, and they are fast, and they are not unbreakable, but they are quite robust. And so people are out there flying all across the world. And it looks like certain industries use drones more than others, but in agriculture, it looks like that'll be $1 billion a year industry by 2024. Some of the quick background onto what you need to know about flying drones is you have to be a licensed pilot to fly for agriculture or to fly for pay. And the Federal Aviation Administration regulates that licensure as well as regulating the airspace. And so there are several important restrictions that you have to know before getting into this field. And so the link that I have on the screen right now is a good place to start to understand what those restrictions are. With respect to precision farming, pretty much a standard operation now across a good portion of the world. Anywhere from guided equipment, guided planting, satellite guided equipment is happening right now, especially in places like China and Japan, because it's hard to get farmers and enough farmers to feed the population. Starting to see a lot more robotics in agriculture at this time. So precision agriculture itself uses technology, especially with respect to remote sensing, to monitor plant health, to maximize yield, and to save money. So there are a number of different sensors that are out there now. Soil moisture sensors, temperature sensors, humidity sensors, and you see this especially in places like vineyards, orchards, and other high dollar crops, especially soil moisture and that sort of thing. Now the spectral sensors usually are on airborne platforms. So this will be on a drone, an airplane, and sometimes you'll see satellite sensors used in agriculture. And then once these data are collected, an agronomist looks at this data and interprets it. So a typical drone camera that you would see on a normal drone, it can see things like irrigation leaks, you can see some weeds, you can see the size, you can count, but you cannot monitor plant health that way. So you need a special sensor, and it's called a spectral sensor, and they have a number of bands in them, and I'll explain that more in a minute. And the number of bands that you have is very important. And in a multispectral sensor like what Drew's company makes, 4, 5, or 6 bands are the most common. Drew's company, as you'll see here in a sec, makes a 5-band sensor. That's its biggest seller. So what about these sellers? Why do they work? That sort of thing. The reflectance spectrum of a typical green leaf here on the screen is the green line, and an unhealthy leaf is the red line. So some of the things you may notice in this graph is that there's a little hump there at the green, and the reason why leaves are green is because leaves do not use that portion of the spectrum. They reflect it, and that's why they look like they're green. Drew's sensor, the Micah Sense Red Edge, takes portions of the spectrum, we call these bands, at particular wavelengths and at particular widths, and looks at those individually and takes those images, and then what we do is we stack those on top of each other to get a complete image, and I'll show you an example here in a moment. And the reason why this is important is because plants and leaves use different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. So you see there's a lot of activity in the violet and the blue, and that is because that is where there's the most energy in the electromagnetic spectrum. But you may notice there's also a couple little bumps there in the red. Leaves use the red portion of the spectrum because that is the portion of light that gets through smoke, dust, and that sort of thing, and also through leaf canopy as well. So plants have adapted to having an atmosphere full of dust, and they can collect light in the red edge of the spectrum as well. So precision agriculture with drones. What we do is we find that drones and precision agriculture increase yields and yield quality, and that's especially important for hemp because when you grow hemp outside for oil, it's a very hungry plant, and I'll show some examples of that here in a minute. You also decrease your fertilizer inputs because you're only applying the fertilizer where it is needed. You don't have to apply it over the entire field. You can also catch pests early if you fly often enough. You can catch irrigation leaks and inefficiencies as well. I'll have an example of that in a minute. And it's also very easy to scout for weeds with drones. Now, with respect to hemp and precision agriculture, absolutely it can make a difference at the right scale. And what's important to understand is the cost and the time may mean that you need to hire a pilot at first. And what I mean by that is the cost of the drone and the time that it takes for you to learn how to fly this thing may drive you to hiring a pilot at first. And if you do, you want to ensure that that pilot has access to vegetation indices that are appropriate for hemp. And I will explain that here in a minute. And one thing that's very important to understand is this is a new paradigm, and make sure that you ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Always ask questions. The extension agency in your state may or may not be the best source. Some are better than others. Some have caught up, some have not. So there's much to learn, and it's going to be up to you and the questions that you ask to get the appropriate information that you need. Also, what's appropriate is the right sensor is the key to the best information. We use Drew's Red Edge because we get the best results from that, and we get the best results because 5 bands gives us the flexibility to collect more data and interpret more data. I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to Drew to get his perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That was a great intro to kind of set the set the stage for digging in a little deeper into multispectral imagery. So I'm going to spend some time covering, giving you an overview of the company, Micah Sense, where we've come from, where we're at currently, and then we'll get right into what a multispectral sensor captures, specifically what the red edge from Micah Sense captures, and then we'll look at some examples of use as it relates to cannabis. So Micah Sense is a company. We're based in Seattle, Washington. We've been around since 2014. The first sensor that we developed and offered to the market was called the Red Edge 1. What you're looking at on the right-hand side of your screen in the middle there, the silver sensor is what we call Red Edge MX. It's the fourth rendition of, actually the fifth rendition of the Red Edge camera. So it's a 5-band multispectral camera, as Dan mentioned before. And then below that, we also released recently, late in 2018, a more advanced sensor called Altum that has the same 5 spectral bands. You'll see those bigger lenses on that. They have higher resolution imagers, so you're able to capture higher spatial resolution multispectral data. And it also has a thermal imager from FLIR, so you're getting a 6th layer that's giving you temperature data on the plant canopy as well. So we're not going to talk too much about Altum in this webinar. We're going to more focus on Red Edge data, but that's kind of what we produce. Currently, we have sensors in over 70 countries. I would argue that we're essentially the standard when it comes to drone-based multispectral imagery. So the people that are using our sensors generally fall into these 3 categories. So researchers, that could be academic or commercial, really anyone who's doing research that is associated with a plant canopy. So you could think of people doing plant breeding or plant physiology research or forestry research, conservation research, really anything that is associated with a plant canopy. In research, people are generally using our cameras for the remote sensing part. And then on the commercial side, larger organizations who are doing plant breeding, they're also using our camera. Government agencies like the USDA, Agri-Foods Canada, entities like that around the world for different countries use our sensors for conservation work, for just species differentiation and keeping track of invasive species. And then the third group that would probably fall into the people interested in this webinar, and which is kind of the emerging group. It's probably the minority at this point, but it's growing every month, is high-value crop farmers and farm managers. So let's look at the multispectral sensor and what it's actually capturing. So this is the Red Edge MX. Similar to the graph that Dan showed you earlier, in this little graph that you're seeing on the right-hand central side of your screen, is a portion of the light spectrum. So we're looking at, on the x-axis, we're looking at visible light, and then beyond that, we're looking at a small portion of beyond visible light and near infrared. Inside that graph is a green line representing the typical reflectance of a healthy plant. And on the y-axis, we're looking at percentage reflectance, so from 0% up to 50%. So if you start on the left side and follow that green line across the graph, you're seeing that it has very low reflectance at blue. It bumps up a little bit at green, and then it drops again at red, and then it increases into near infrared. So what our camera is doing is it's capturing 5 discrete spectral bands. It's capturing 5 pieces of reflectance to learn more about the physiology of that plant. So we're capturing a blue band, a green band, red edge, and near infrared. So probably the best way to describe how these bands can be helpful to understanding a plant physiology is looking at the red band. That red band is positioned along the spectrum where it's most common to see the highest absorbance of red for photosynthesis. So in the middle of the growing season, typically plants are absorbing a lot of red light for photosynthesis. They're growing, they need that light, they're absorbing a lot of red light. As the plant gets into the fall, it starts to die typically. If you look at trees, the leaves tend to change color into the fall. And you'll start to see a decrease in red absorbance and more red reflectance. So that's why you see those pretty colors and, on the East Coast of the leaves changing. It's because they're not using as much of that red, they're reflecting more of it. So when we look at red reflectance, that red spectral band, if that image is dark, that means that the plant is typically in a healthy state. If that red spectral band image starts to lighten up, then we assume that it's not absorbing red light as effectively, and it's probably unhealthy, or it's dying. Something's going on there physiologically. So the images below are kind of interesting. They're the raw images from the camera, unprocessed images, and you can see that they're all grayscale. So they're all just black and white images. All we care about is how light or how dark they are in those positions to better understand the reflectance, which in turn allows us to better understand the physiology of the plant. So what we can do with the data set from the Red Edge MX is we can take those 5 separate data sets, blue, green, red, red edge, and near infrared, and we can combine those to gather intel about the plant canopy. These are a few different examples of different data sets that we can generate using those 5 spectral bands to give us more information about what's going on in the canopy. So we can create an RGB composite to just get a visual of what the canopy looks like with the naked eye. So just what you would see if you looked at an airplane and saw the plant canopy. We can create indices that give us a better indication of the chlorophyll content variability. So we call that a chlorophyll map. NDVI, a lot of people on this call have probably heard of that. That's giving you an indication of biomass variability, so how bushy or how thin the plant is. So there's just a plethora of different kinds of data sets that we can gather. Each one is giving us a little bit of a different picture and understanding of what's going on in that canopy. So we've done some research in cannabis over the last few years. I think at this stage, and Dan's going to show us a few examples of some of his work as well. But I think from Micah Sense perspective, it's kind of untapped opportunity because there's been some research there. I think it's only really scratched the surface of what is possible with multispectral imagery as it relates to cannabis production. But one thing that I've heard, and one thing that we've worked on a little bit in the past, is that it's really important to differentiate a male plant from a female plant. And that's something that's been really difficult in the past, and it's difficult to do visually. And so that's something that I'm going to dig into a little bit deeper here. So first, let's start with a case study that's not cannabis. So this is volunteer grapevines. And let me give you a little bit of backstory on this case study. So I'm by no means an expert in growing grapes, but my understanding is that typically a vineyard is going to have a rootstock, and then the vineyard manager is going to graft a specific variety onto that rootstock to produce the grapes. So that's the process that happens to get to grape production. The issue is that sometimes when you graft on a desired variety onto that rootstock, the graft will fail, and the rootstock will actually produce a shoot, and it'll produce grapes that are undesirable. So a variety that is not desirable, that's probably tastes bad, that's poor quality, that's going to decrease the value of your harvest. The trouble is that the undesired variety from the rootstock and the desired variety from the grafted variety is they look almost identical. The leaves look very similar, the grapes look very similar. So it's pretty labor intensive to walk row by row to visually identify the good variety versus the bad variety and to cut out the bad variety. So what we did was we flew a vineyard with the Red Edge, and here we're looking at the NDVI of the vineyard. So we're using the red and near infrared bands to create this biomass variability map. What we see here is there's a little bit of lower biomass in the center of the field, but there's no indication that there's there's no indication of species differentiation here. So we can't see the good versus the bad variety in NDVI. When we go to a composite that we generated, so this is another layer that we were able to produce using some of the bands from the red edge. It's interesting here, you can see that the varieties are suddenly apparent. So most of the field is this kind of yellowish color, and then the rootstock shoot is showing up as orange. So something that was not visible in RGB, wasn't visible in NDVI, suddenly becomes apparent in this weed layer. Another thing we did was we took the RGB layer and then we added the chlorophyll map on top of that, and then we were able to basically isolate a certain value from the chlorophyll map to make those volunteer vines even more apparent. So at this stage, basically we've just saved a whole day of work. So if instead of sending a few people out in the field to walk row by row to try to identify those volunteer vines, we've isolated where they're located. They walk straight to those points, cut out the volunteer vines, and the day is over. So another one is distinguishing weeds from crops and potatoes. So this is the RGB composite that we generated after flying a potato pivot. And you can see, everything is pretty green. There's a little bit darker green in some spots. When we use the weeds layer, suddenly the broadleaf weeds that are in that field are showing up as red, and the potatoes are showing up as yellow. So this is another good example of being able to differentiate between plant species more clearly using this data. Okay, so now let's look at a cannabis data set where we're essentially attempting to do something similar to what we did in the vines and the potatoes. So what we did here is we're looking at the RGB composite on the far right side. We've identified one of these plants as being hermaphroditic, so it's got male and female reproductive organs, and we've named it Herbie. I'm not really sure why we named it that. One of the researchers at Micah named it that. In the middle image here, we're looking at just the red edge layer of reflectance. So we're just basically looking at the red edge layer raw. It's not a composite or an index, it's just the red edge layer. And what we're seeing is this plant is showing a little bit higher reflectance than the plants around it in the southern half of that plant. And what our remote sensing scientist did was he looked at all the different layers, the 5 layers in the red edge camera, and he identified that in green and in red edge, that plant was showing the biggest difference from a very bushy, healthy looking plant in the field to that hermaphroditic plant. And so what he did was he made a composite using the green layer and the red edge layer to try to basically isolate that plant even further. And so on the far right side is essentially the result. So you're getting a little bit more clarity onto what plant is the hermaphroditic plant. So I know this isn't like a super satisfying case study, because as you can see on the far right side, it gives you a little bit more clarification on which plant is the hermaphroditic plant, but it's not super clear. So I guess the take home here is that I hope that you can see what we've done in other crops to kind of get your mental juices flowing on what is potentially possible with more research into cannabis. And my example is basically specifically related to identifying male versus female plants. Okay, so I wanted to show you just a few other things that we've done in terms of just management of the field. So this is more like inventory management, what's out in the field, what's potential for harvest at the end of the season. So this is a cannabis field as well. What we've done here is we basically have streamlined the process of identifying small, medium, and large size plants. So this, if the size of the plant is in any way related to the potential for harvest, then this would give you a better indication of what, I guess it would give you a couple of things. It would give you an indication of what you can expect when the plant has reached maturity point or the harvest point. And then another thing is you can look at areas where the plants are a little more sparse and maybe go scouting to determine what could be going on in the field. So another thing that we did is we just did straight up plant counting of these cannabis plants. So this is just another sort of inventory or trying to determine what is the potential for yield at harvest time. So we had about 2.5 acres here. The number of plants are about 5,100. And then, whatever the average is for what you can harvest off of a single cannabis plant, multiplied by that number would give you kind of a rough estimate of what you'd expect at harvest. So that's kind of the extent of the cannabis examples that I have, and I think Dan has a few more to run through, so I'll pass it over to you, Dan.
All right, thanks, Drew. I appreciate it. That was a real nice cross-section of what the red edge sensor can do, and we agree. Everyone here at Arbor Drone and Spectrobotics agrees that the red edge is the standard, and one of the reasons why it's a standard is its resolution and the number of bands that it provides. And so short of getting a hyperspectral sensor, 50, 100, 150 bands, it's about as good as you can get. So what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time on what we flew last year and some of our examples of what we found in our field season, and walk you through what you can see and what you can expect from precision agriculture with drones. So when I say VI, I mean vegetation index, and that is basically taking one or more bands and doing something with them, adding them, subtracting them from each other, dividing them into each other, some sort of thing to give us information about that plant. So the chlorophyll content is generally found in the red and the red edge. There is some information you can get from the green and the blue as well, and so you basically take these bands and you do something with them. And if you have a formal process that you go through with mathematics with these bands, and people do it over and over, that's called the vegetation index. And so the NDVI, normalized difference vegetation index, is the standard index that's used for many crops, so corn, wheat, soy, that sort of thing. And we'll get into this a little bit more here in a minute. But this is a hemp field, and we did our field season last year in Colorado, and so all these examples are from Colorado. And so what you can see here on the right side of the field in those 4 rows, one row is partially cut off, is a lot of red and a lot of yellow, and we colored this tool to show red and yellow as being better, and green and blue as being not so good. And so the 4 rows on the right are examples of plants that are better, that have more chlorophyll, that are more healthy, and then all those rows on the left from the center over, those are a little bit more unhealthy. And we'll look at these here in detail as we go forward. So what you can see in between the rows, mostly these are male plants that have just been harvested. So we flew this field the day of the harvest of the male plants. And so those have a particular look to them. You can see those plants on the ground there. Here in Colorado, you have to measure the biomass of what you harvest. And so those are laid out for later measurement. These 4 or 5 rows on the right here, you can also see there's a little bit of weed activity in there as well. So let's just go back, and you can see the chlorophyll in the healthy plants, and then you can see what that looks like in what we call RGB. And so when we say RGB, we mean red, green, blue, and those are slices of the spectrum, and that gives us some information. So you can get an idea about this field here. This is hill culture under plastic with drip tape. The one thing that I want to point out is if you're thinking about doing this and you're going out to a pilot or to a service that does typical precision agriculture, and they do corn or wheat or something like that, they generally just do a standard analysis NDVI, normalized difference vegetation index. And that's perfectly fine for corn or wheat or something like that, but for hemp, it doesn't work that well. And the reason why it doesn't work that well is because there's so many leaves and they're so thick and the plant is so big that this particular vegetation index does what we call saturates. And so you can see all these images here, just all this red. The reflectance has saturated in these plants because they're large and getting close to maturity. And so the reflectance just can't be, nothing can be done with it with this particular vegetation index. And so you can see here, here's your visual, then here's your NDVI, and then we compare that with one of the tools that we use here. And so I just point this out just so you can get an example of some of the questions that you want to start asking yourself if you're going to hire a pilot and get this service to get a better idea of the health of your hemp crop, is that a standard vegetation index for corn is not going to work that well. So just keep that in mind as we go forward here. So here's this visual again, just to get the difference for you here. So visual, you can get a fairly good idea of the health of your crop just by looking at it visually. You can see these 4 or 5 rows on the right. Fairly large, fairly uniform canopy, fairly deep green. And then the ones over on the left here, a little bit less uniform, a little bit less green. And so you can get some information visually, but with the spectral sensors where you get the best information. And what I mean by that, especially at this scale, gives you a good idea. So we've colored this particular tool with red being better and blue and green being not so good. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of red in this field, but there's also a number of places where there is not red in this field. And so these are the places that are containing plants that have a little bit less vigor. And so these would be the areas where you would send somebody out with some fertilizer, a backpack spray or something like that, and attend to these plants right here. Rather than fertilizing your whole field, only maybe 30% of this field needs to be fertilized. So you're saving this money by knowing exactly what plants where need the attention. And so one thing that I wanted to bring up, we're starting to see this more and more in applications, and it's just starting to be introduced into agriculture, and this is machine learning. And what machine learning is basically teaching computer programs how to learn and what to look for, and getting more and more information and learning from that and making that analysis. And this is something that we're introducing this year in our work to our clients. And you're going to be seeing this quite a bit here in the next few years as machine learning starts to catch on, the computing power continues to increase, and more applications start to use it, especially agriculture. So this is that same field analyzed with machine learning, and then we colored the results here with the red being bad and green being good. And so you can see the extent of the field that needs attention as compared to the extent of the field that doesn't need attention. And so this is a machine learning analysis. We took some vegetation indices, we took the RGB, we took the visual, and we taught the computer what a good healthy plant looks like and what an unhealthy plant looks like. It went through the field and identified all those areas of good and bad plants. And so this is something you'll be seeing more and more often as you go forward. And this takes some of the burden off of the grower to interpret some of the results of vegetation indices and analyses. Let's go and do another example. This is in a different place in Colorado, and this is a different field. This is about a 5-acre field right here, right in the middle. And as we zoom in there, you can probably see up toward the top of the screen that there's something going on. And as we zoom in a little bit more, looks like there's a water issue there. So this is a true color. So this is with another one of our drones here that you could buy off the shelf for not too much money. to do some scouting, and you can see right away that there's an irrigation issue here. And it's been going on long enough that the plants, where their feet are wet, are stunted. And so that's one of the things about hemp, is that it's a very forgiving plant, but it does not like to have its feet wet, and it does prefer good drainage. And you can see that effect here where this irrigation break was. So as you look in another part of this field, you can see that, again, this is row culture and hill culture, and then it's under plastic with drip tape. And this particular example here, you can see quite a bit of weed activity on the left and not so much here on the right. And if you look across in the center, you can see that recently the male plants were harvested in this field as well. So one thing to keep in mind with just a visual assessment here, this is a true color. So it would be a typical camera on a typical drone, just doing a scouting flight. What you can see just with the visual is you can scout for weeds, you can scout for a little bit of color variation, so that plant toward the top, just to the left of center with a little bit of green in it, that's probably a little bit less healthy. You're telling yourself, why is that not a deep green, that sort of thing. And so there is a little bit of information that you can get from a visual assessment, but when you start to look through the multispectral assessment, you can see right away that there's a difference here between the two sides of this field. And so let me just go back here again. And so you've got your visual assessment, and you get some information. Now here you are with a multispectral analysis. And so this is one of the tools that we've developed for hemp. And so this allows us to look at the health of the plant and get some of these weeds that are in the background out of the way, so we could look at the plant. It's very difficult to get weeds out of the background when you're looking at multispectral imagery and analysis, and that's one of the reasons why we're going toward machine learning and looking at these rows in the center and the left. You can see how difficult it is to separate weeds from plants and why we'd want to go toward machine learning. So just to wrap up here and help you think about wrapping your mind around making a decision about precision agriculture and hemp and whether or not you want to go in this direction. It's all about your return on investment. And generally when people give pricing in precision agriculture and flying with drones, it's very common to get cost per acre. So they're going to charge you a certain amount per acre to fly and to analyze. And so one of the things that we're not 100% clear yet is what's the scale to get you a good return on investment. What's the minimum acreage? Is it 2 acres? Is it 5? That's something that I don't think is clear across the country yet, and that's one of the reasons why you want to think about asking questions and getting the right analyses from your pilot, because there's no clear roadmap yet. It's a little bit too early. Hopefully by the end of this year we'll have enough data out in the industry and we'll have a good idea of what a return on investment is at a pure market scale. One thing that's important with your return on investment is thinking about whether or not you want to buy your equipment and fly yourself, or have a family member or a staff person that works for you fly that, versus hiring a pilot. And to me, the two most important things that you want to think about is how long is it going to take you to decide upon buying a drone, then learning how to fly that thing without crashing it, and getting yourself up to speed where you're very comfortable going out and just flying your field and then coming back and downloading that data somewhere. And is it 30 hours of flying time? Is it 40 hours of flying time? That's an individual thing, whether or not you're comfortable with risk, that sort of thing. So that's the most important thing, getting yourself up to speed. And that 20, 30, 40 hours, that's quite a bit of time. And so is it worth it to you, or is it worth it to you to hire a pilot? And the other thing, if it's worth it to you, there is a cost for licensure. When I took my test, it was $150. I have to renew every 2 years. I'm up again in May, and then so I have to pay again to renew my license. So that's another expense. So weighing that and all those expenses and your time with hiring a pilot, now that's where you get your price per acre and your price for analysis. And the other thing involved there is, can they come back every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks on a regular schedule, so you can get a good idea of change over time for your field. And so those are the two most important things to think about when you want to go into precision agriculture with drones or not. In my view, right now, with the returns possible per acre with hemp that people are getting last year and most likely this year, it's probably a good investment if you don't have a good idea of your soil, your drainage, that sort of thing, and you want to get your mind around what your field is doing, how fertile it is, what needs work, what doesn't need work, that sort of thing. The returns that you're probably going to get on your crop this year and next year are going to be enough to justify paying somebody to fly your field if this is something that you're interested in. And especially what I want to make clear is the more bands that you get in a spectral sensor, the better off you are. We fly the red edge. We think it gives the best information. And then your analysis partner, that company that's going to do that analysis, and their agronomist, can they do analyses that are outside of the typical crop analysis with the NDVI? So those are the most important things to wrap your mind around, to think about doing precision agriculture for your field. You're certainly going to get enough information. It's out there. People can process that for you. It does appear to me right now that your returns on your field are going to be enough to justify doing precision agriculture, and it's just about finding the right team to collect and process that data for you. And so that's about it for me, and I think we're just about ready for Q&A.
Great. Dan and Drew, appreciate you giving us all that information. What a wealth of knowledge here. I've got a handful of questions I want to go through. They're kind of all over the place, and so just bear with me as we kind of bounce around with some of these. One I want to hit on is kind of what you just kind of ended on with the ROI component. And I want to see if I can dig a little bit deeper on this question, particularly, Dan, on you mentioned the cost of pilots versus purchasing an aircraft. Can you give us a little more detail on what is that cost for both today? And does it matter where you are for that cost? Meaning geographically, can you get better deals if you're in farmland versus not farmland? So if you could you share some of that information on pricing and cost, and does it matter where you're located?
Sure. It definitely matters where you're located. Generally in the center of the country, where there's quite a few pilots and extra pilots, that makes the cost go down. And so generally those costs are expressed either in a per hour or per acre basis. And so generally, if you're flying a multi-rotor drone, and you can get about 100 acres an hour, and so then that translates, if you're getting somebody quoting you a price of $100 or $125 an hour, then that's about $1 an acre. Other places where there may not be as many pilots, or they're in higher demand and busier all the time, you may get a price somewhere around $150 an hour, or anywhere from $1 to $3 an acre. And so that's on the pilot side. And then you're looking at on the analysis side, where you're probably where place is not as important, and so it's going to be a pure cost anywhere between $2 to $5 per acre.
Okay. To kind of build on that, another question just kind of popped in was, how do you go about finding a good team to perform the data collection and analysis? And so, where can they go find these things? Is it a Google search? What do you recommend?
You can definitely do a Google search pretty much anywhere across the country. There's going to be within 50 miles of you, or 100 miles of you, depending upon exactly where you are in the middle of the country. There's going to be a city that has a data processing firm, and so you're just looking for somebody that does data processing. If you're a little bit more adventurous in your Google search, you can look for agricultural data processing, and then they're going to have a website, and then they're going to have numerous pictures and analyses of the kind of crops that they fly. And what you're really looking for is an analysis team that does trees, so orchards and vines, any sort of large plant like that. If they're analyzing trees, they can most likely analyze hemp, because I really consider hemp almost like a tree, just because it's just so thick and dense that its reflectance acts like a tree. So, and once you find 2 or 3 companies, make sure that their prices are all in line with each other, and just get some idea of what sort of things they analyze, how many pilots they have, how open they are to coming out every 2-3 weeks. You know, will they give you a price break if they fly 10 times a year, that sort of thing.
Great. Great information. All right, these things are coming in like crazy now, so I'm just trying to weed through these. Here's another question. Is there any integration kits for the Micah Sense on the Phantom 4, or is there an upgrade to a Matrix or the likes recommended?
Yeah, this is Drew. There's one of our resellers based in Michigan actually has a good Phantom 4 integration. We don't sell one directly, so I guess I would recommend getting in touch with that organization for that integration. You can just reach out to Micah Sense directly, and we can give you that information. And then Micah Sense develops and sells integration kits for the Inspire 1, the Inspire 2, the Matrice 100, the Matrice 600, and then we have solutions for the Matrice 200 as well.
Okay, perfect. Here's another question around software. Is the software for processing included with the RedX MX?
No, so we just provide the hardware, and then you'll have to look into, we can advise you on what software to use, but we don't sell it direct. So there's a number of different options for software and analytics.
Okay. Any ideas of just what a hemp grower would find useful to know what he or she would not be able to get on the ground? Question.
This is Dan. It depends upon the scale of your operation. If you're just doing 5 acres and you have the time and this is your main source of income, it's easy enough to walk that 5 acres every day. If you are doing, I would say, well, it depends upon how much time you have and everything like that, but if you're 20, 25, 30 acres or more, or if your plots are scattered, or if you are leasing a bunch of land that's scattered across a particular area and you may not have the time to walk those fields quite often, then that's where you would turn to a drone with a sensor on there to do that scouting for you. So it all depends on how much time you have and how much time you can spend in your field.
Yeah, and it also comes down to what you're looking for. So we both touched on the advantages of capturing narrow spectral bands, seeing slight changes in reflectance. That's stuff that you're not going to be able to see visually with your, using your eyes. So the data itself is providing you with information that's not necessarily easy to see just by scouting the field on the ground.
Yep, that technology does a lot better than our eyes can do, that's for sure. What software do you use to process the images collected from the sensor? How long does that data take to process given a 100-acre field, for example?
This is Dan.
Do you want to talk about some of your, I was just going to say, do you want to talk about some of your experiences and then I can fill in the gaps maybe?
Sure. For 100 acres, our company, we can process that probably in, it depends on exactly how much data are in there, but we can process that in several hours, I would say 2 to 3, and turn that around for the client. They can have that immediately thereafter. There are two different ways of getting software. There's either an online cloud-based agricultural platform, and their times are similar. Then there's the data provider on the ground that you would look for in a company that would be near you or online that you're comfortable with, companies such as ours. And the other thing that you want to think about when you're looking for a software provider is whether or not they can provide someone for you to interpret that data so you don't have to do that yourself. Or if not, then is there an agronomist nearby that can interpret that data for you? So that's an important consideration to look for when you're looking for software. Go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well. I think what we typically do is when someone comes to us and buys a sensor or is looking for advice on how to process the data, it's good to get information on what is the crop that they're wanting to analyze, or what kind of work they're going to be doing. Are they going to be doing research, or are they going to be doing more just general field management? And then there are kind of a number of different possible solutions for that. So I think Spectrobotics, has their specialization. There are other companies out there that have their specialization. So it kind of depends on what you want to do, but there are definitely a lot of different options out there, as Dan covered.
Great. Here's a question for you, Dan. Is there any resources available online to further explore the algorithms and band comparisons used in either your examples or other examples available for cannabis?
Are we talking about, can you tell or can you get a clarification, are we talking about the different types of sensors, or are we talking about research that has looked at different vegetation indices to do health analysis?
I can't really draw from what I've got there, but I think just in general,
Okay.
Is there any just good data collection available yet outside of what you guys have done, I think?
There are some folks that have done that, but you're really going to have to dig, and most of it's been research, and a number of the state extension offices are doing research on that right now. I'm in Colorado, and CSU, Colorado State University, is heavy into that right now. But it's just on the applied side at the farm level, there's not a lot of it yet, and so we're one of just a couple that are out there doing that right now. And but the research side of it is pretty decent, and there is quite a bit of research out there that you can see. We hope to have enough acreage this year on the applied side where we can really get our work out there and have people look at that in the form of white papers or journal articles, that sort of thing. But it's mostly on the research side right now.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you go to micahsense.com, there's a page in there that's for researchers, and you can access a number of different publications that have used Red Edge in their research. So I think you'll find a lot of different indices and composites that have been used for different purposes in there. That's a good resource to explore.
Yeah, what I can say, if I can jump right back in here real quick, what I can say is that we find, just in general, that 3-band analyses are much more useful to us for hemp than just a 2-band. And so it's a little bit vague, but that gets you kind of pointed in a direction of looking for solutions and analyses for that.
Okay. Here's a question for you, pretty easy. What kind of drones do you recommend?
We typically,
You want to take?
we have people across the board. Yeah. We have users across the board, anywhere from Phantom 4 all the way up to almost military-grade drones. So again, it depends on what kind of area you're wanting to cover, how slowly you're wanting to capture data, or how fast. I'm assuming for most of the people on this call, if they're if they're growing hemp, they're probably smaller fields. So just a typical quadcopter would probably be sufficient. So one of the DJI drones bigger than a Mavic would be usable.
Okay. I'm getting a few questions in from our audience asking if this will be later put online for them to come back and listen to, so I'll let them know that it will be available in about another week for you to have access to any time to listen to this again, so just know that will be available to you. There's another question that came in that sounds like he missed the first part of this webcast, and really just about identification of sex. And so I just encourage you to go back and re-listen to this as we cover that topic. And yes, the technology can understand male and female pretty easily. If you guys want to add to that, feel free.
That's one of the things we're going to be focusing on in this field season is trying to nail down male and female early enough to do a usable harvest. And I would just, I guess in general, just say check this space, and we'll let everyone know about our results when we get them.
Yeah, the work that we did, it was hopeful. I don't think it led us to any conclusive answers, but just based on the work that we've done in other crops, I think with more work, with more research, like Dan said, I think over the next year or two, you might see a solution for that. That's clear.
Okay. I've got a few more here. To kind of expand on band sensors, you say more bands are better. What do you mean by that?
So basically, the reason more bands are better, the more positions along the plant's reflectance profile you can capture, the better understanding you have of what's truly going on physiologically. So people who are using two-band cameras, like cameras that are capturing red and near infrared, you're getting 2 points of reference along that plant's reflectance profile. So you know what's happening at red and you know what's happening at near infrared, but you don't know what's happening at the other positions. So occasionally there are points along the growth, along the plant's growth stages, or there are nutrient deficiencies or diseases that can impact the plant in a way that it shifts reflectance at a position other than red and near infrared. And if you're only capturing those two spectral bands, you're not getting that information. So basically, the more points of reference you have along that plant's reflectance profile, the better and more holistic picture you're going to have of what's actually happening.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good answer. And what I would add to that is the more bands that you get, the more cost is associated with both the sensor itself and the analysis. Just want to make sure that that's clear. When you start getting into sensors that are giving you 50 bands, that is a completely different animal than the red edge sensor.
Okay. Here's a question I have for you is, can this be applied to my greenhouse growing and indoor growing? And do you guys have that capability to scale this down to work in that setting as well? As I personally, through my projects, would love to be able to integrate this type of technology into my indoor growing settings.
So as it relates to Micah Sense cameras, we don't advise it. There's no commercially available processing solution that can handle the data that's captured at close range with our cameras. That being said, there are some academic institutions who have used our cameras in greenhouses with some success. I think University of Wisconsin comes to mind as one that has generated a few different indices and composites looking at plants in a greenhouse on a plant-by-plant basis. But it's not easy, and there are some hurdles that you have to jump through, and there's just some distortion of the data that occurs when you're capturing it at close range.
Great answer. All right.
Yeah.
Good to know. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that looking at the trends in the industry, you're probably at least 3 years out to have a decent solution to go to market that's affordable. Probably 5 would be my guess to have a decent market solution. I know that they're working on those sort of things in different aspects with cameras on wires and with small drone swarms, but it's not anywhere close to being marketable yet.
Dang, you just broke my heart, guys. I don't want to wait that long. Okay, guys, we're kind of at the top of the hour. To kind of wrap this up, I'd love to get some closing comments from both of you to our audience, so please feel free to give any closing comments.
Yeah, I can start. I'll go ahead and start, Dan. You can close it out. So if anyone in the audience has further questions about our cameras, you can feel free to reach out to me directly. My email address is drew@micahsense.com. Our website provides quite a bit of information about our products. We also have a blog that covers a lot of different case studies. So I think it's blog.micahsense.com. So if you just want to read stories about how people are using the technology I don't think we have any hemp or cannabis case studies on there, but there are a bunch of different crops that might get your creative juices flowing, like I said before, and help you to understand different applications in cannabis.
And this is Dan. I'd be happy to answer follow-up questions to anybody out there. My email is dan@arbordrone.net, and my website is arbordrone.net. My business partner is Spectrobotics, and you can see them at spectrobotics.com, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'd just like to reiterate that it does seem that if you've got the acreage and need some help, that precision agriculture with drones for your hemp crop is a viable solution. And make sure that you ask questions, make sure that you get examples from your prospective companies, and make sure that they can work with you and ensure that they can deliver the product that you need. And that's it for me.
Well, I can't thank you both for getting on today. Great topic. I have a lot of interest in this myself and what we do as a company, and so looking forward to our conversation to see how you can help us this year. And through our Q&A, we got quite a bit of input from our audience, so I'm excited to see that there was quite a bit of interest in this today. This will be released again in the next week or so and be live and available for anyone to listen at any time, so keep an eye out for that. Once again, I want to thank Dan Staley and Drew Bostian for talking to us today about how to boost hemp production using multispectral imagery. I also want to thank our sponsor, Cannabis Tech, for hosting our webcast for us today. I'm your host, Ellis Smith, with American Cannabis. We look forward to hearing or listening to you next week or next month. Thank you for tuning in today, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.